Welcome, everybody. My topic today, or my topic today, sounds like I'm giving a lecture, but my paper for this semester dealt with mimetic theory, and that is put forward by Rene Girard. Let me go ahead and get my PowerPoint up, and we can get started on that. Share it. There we go. Rene Girard, I ran into his books probably about a year ago. I was reading something else and it made a reference to it and about mimetic theory and how he was a professor at Stanford. And it was interesting enough that I pulled a couple of books and started reading them and then realized that for this class, there's an interesting application in terms of theology. So René Girard, just a little background, came to the U.S. in 1947, got his PhD in history from the University of Indiana. He came from France, where he also had a background in history, but he realized after a time that he didn't want to spend his time in history digging through dusty tomes in various parts of France for historical work. So he came to the U.S., got his degree in history. What I liked about him is he adopted a multidisciplinary approach to mimetic theory. And I'll get into that as we move along. He integrated literature, language, sociology, anthropology, and theology. I think theology came towards the very end, the later part of what he was doing, but is nevertheless interesting. And what he was looking to do was say something about humankind and cultural development in a kind of a big meta theory. Now, while he's doing this, of course, he's doing this during the 60s and 70s, during the time in which most meta theories, virtually all meta theories, were up against the deconstructionists who were just dismantling this idea of the grand narrative that was put forward by Western white male dominated oppressive societies that had kind of been the academic way to look at the world through Western eyes. And so deconstructionalists took all that apart. And then from that, you get the introduction of feminism, colonial cultural imperialism, a lot of which articles we read probably a few weeks ago, and how those became their own academic worlds as they took the big grand narratives apart. So Girard was fighting against this when he started to develop his theory, the mimetic theory, into a little bit more detail. So another way to look at this too is liberals see mimetic theory as a threat. That is, it's another grand narrative that has to be taken apart. And conservatives see it as encouraging and supportive for social stability. So let's get into a little bit of this theory, and I'll get into a little bit of why I thought it particularly fit in terms of what we were doing. Interestingly enough, mimetic theory starts out with desire, the role that desire plays for all of us. And he looks at it by looking at the sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth commandments that prohibits what he calls the most serious acts of violence. You shall not kill, commit adultery, steal, or bear false witness against your neighbor. But the 10th commandment, he says, is really kind of odd and different because it forbids desire. And so what he's talking about in the 10th commandment, just to remind everybody, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. In other words, don't desire what your neighbor has. That's not how you should live your life. So in his mind, when he got to that, he's like, wow, okay, this is kind of unusual. You don't normally see these kinds of things in terms of coveting or desiring in this case. Coveting equals desire. So he thought that was kind of interesting and a different view of the world from what he had seen in his work in sociology and anthropology. So he starts to focus on desire and coveting in the 10th commandment. So the best way to think about this in terms of mimetic theory, there's three pieces to it. So the first one is humankind is imitative by nature. In other words, we have a desire to look at what other people have or what other people are learning or creating, and we want that. We learn by observation. We are not born into families and then grow up on our own without any influence. We're influenced by everything around it. So we imitate what we see. Now, his argument is that as we imitate and grow up, we may see somebody or something that we like or want, and from that, we desire the same thing. And we may look to a friend or whoever is showing us that desire and say, wow, they're real. I want to imitate them. I want to be like them. But eventually become dissatisfied because they either have more or we can't get what they want. He argues that that leads to violence eventually because we become jealous and enraged at what we see in terms of our ability to imitate what we see. This leads to the second part of his theory, which is the role of the sacrificial scapegoat for victim, which is found, he argues, is found in all primitive societies. So as humankind desires, living in a community, starts to desire things and starts to get out of control and leads to violence. Think of this as a breakdown in temporary breakdown in society. And we saw these in the ancient times. You see it with disease, pestilence, starvation. People become enraged and frustrated, and they look for a scapegoat that is a victim. And that's found, he found in his research in all primitive societies, the Greeks had it, the Romans had it, and even primitive island societies end up with looking for a sacrificial scapegoat. Third part of the theory is this victim, the scapegoat, is despised and innocent and a sacrifice for stability and order. So the victim is either killed or driven from society, and society then returns to a stable and orderly fashion because it's kind of vented all these massive frustrations onto the scapegoat. And his argument has been that that leads to a doom loop of kind of like the cyclical cultural environment, violence within society, and that's religious and led and encouraged by religious and civil authorities. So it becomes part of the society. So, and it becomes this doom loop that's repeated over and over again when society becomes stressed. And usually it's some outside influence that stresses the society. So my thesis was, and I couldn't figure out a really good way to frame it. So we present society as, I would argue that maybe we're returning to myths, stories, and untruths and abandoning the revelatory aspects of Christ's death and resurrection. And the importance of it is innocence, which reveals the mimetic cycle and the role played by desire. So Christ's passion reveals the innocence of the scapegoat. This is kind of what Rene Girard was saying. And I'm saying, you know what, in terms of kind of the upheavals that we're having in society, whether they political, civil, there seems to be something going on. Now, I looked at some of the literature around this, and there's a lot of research on misinformation, disinformation, and incivility, but no one is able to pinpoint exactly what contributes to it. They know it's risen, and they can do certainly plenty of studies and count things that show that. So this was sort of a qualitative way to think about what's going on. And Girard has this mimetic theory with those three parts: that desire, looking for the scapegoat, and the victim that is eventually sacrificed to bring order back to society. So let me go through those again. So mimetic theory of desire, leads to societal instability and the selection of the scapegoat and the assigning of blame, which is death or banishment, and restores order. So his argument is that in theology, the writers of the Bible understood this desire and coveting, and the power of imitation that's present in our lives in terms of our desire to imitate what we see around us to form our individual self. And the importance of the fact that we are actually born into communities. Again, we're not created in terms of maybe how the Enlightenment would think about it, but there is a community that we're born into, and we imitate in that community. The best way to think about this desire is in Greek and Roman mythology. They approve of the scapegoat. If you look at Roman mythology, there's Greek thought mythology, there's plenty of elements of the scapegoat that comes in and everybody points at and is sacrificed. Now, Jesus in the gospel disapprove of the scapegoat, the whole mechanism of the scapegoat. You don't hear anything about it. In Judaism, there was the scapegoat, and again, the goat that was released into the desert, taking all of the sins or evil of society out and away. But it was a goat. It wasn't a person. Um, again, a little bit different. In the Gospels, we don't have that. But this critical, Gerard says, is that the Gospels condemn the persecution and the executioners and seek to protect the innocent victim. So this is a something that's very different from what has come before. So we're with what is occurring is in Christ's passion, the innocence of the victim is brought forward. The Gospels tell that story in detail and vividly. And Gerard makes the argument that that's very different from any of the other myths, stories, what have you, that have occurred over the hundreds of years, thousands of years before that. So Christ's passion and his innocence and what he was preaching and the message is in his mind is a show-stopping event, a total change along the way. Now, there's certainly been tons of criticisms with Gerard's work. Some argued, for example, that it was not Catholic, um, uh, whereas Protestants would argue that humans are totally corrupt. Catholics might argue that the humanity is sick and in need of healing. Again, a lot of apologists have come forward, and he came forward later on in his work. There's a early Gerard, there's a mid Gerard, and then there's late Gerard. So his theory develops over time, and he either writes about it or he is interviewed about it, and seems to be more than happy to incorporate criticism into his work. Some argued that the fall and the sin weren't accounted for, and that's been kind of pushed aside. He argues that mimetic theory is a critical part of Christian revelation. Christ's passion, he argues, is a singular and unpredictable event of unprecedented cultural upheaval. Most folks who have read, even theologians, are like, well, not quite. But they seem to be assigning an interesting aspect to it. The important thing is that the revelation of mimetic theory does not end or prevent it. Let's face it, scapegoating still occurs, probably not to the extent that it did before, but it still exists. But what is recognized is that there is an emphasis on innocence in society. You are guilty until proven innocent. Power does not always simply get its way. Innocence is critical as we move forward as a society. Liberation theologists are actually aware of scapegoating too, and they have introduced it into the communities that they work with to recognize when it is occurring and how counterproductive it can be to moving forward. There's certainly an element of supersessionism within what Gerard's work. He argues that Islam rejected some aspects of Christ's passion in the first murder. Buddhism, he argues, touches aspect of it, but does not fully embrace it, as does Christianity. Judaism, he says, provides the early recognition of mimetic theory, and Christianity completes it. Okay, we've got elements of supersessionism in there. And then it came back to a quote that he said. He says, all religions today teach a proper aversion to anger, resentment, envy, and violence. They do so without being aware of the scapegoat mechanism. So he argues that you need to acknowledge the scapegoat mechanism in order to kind of move yourself away from mimetic theory, and Christianity did through the Gospels and Christ's passion. Other religions teach it, but don't work with it as much as he did. So to conclude, he was pretty pessimistic about mimetic theory going forward. He thought it was possibly too late. He was concerned about the discrediting of Catholicism in particular. And he was arguing that this co-opting of innocence, truth, and justice by pagan forces. I always thought it was sort of a modern liberalism that he wasn't particularly fond of, but would it allow them to twist and manipulate the truth? And that's kind of what we're seeing today, to some extent. And truth is certainly harder to find in a nihilistic world and in a Nietzschean world. And there was a clear rejection of Christian humility, which he thought was not a good idea. In the end, he doesn't necessarily have a solution. I think he wrote a little bit about the power of the Holy Spirit to continue on, but it wasn't necessarily something to embrace. He embraced. I mean, he definitely thought his theory had something to say. And so for this paper, or this project, I was working with this idea that there is something to say here in terms of mimetic theory and what it is trying to say to us, and perhaps we might be forgetting some of those lessons as we move into our own echo chambers. Misinformation is rampant. There certainly is more of an idea of a will to power, um, and power shaping things versus this Christian humility that we seem to have worked with for years and years. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly, and there are times when it just doesn't work. But it seems like there's more of that today than in the past, and so that's kind of what got me interested in kind of bringing this theory to the forefront. So if you have any questions or anything, let me know, and I will go ahead and post this up. So thank you all very much, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.